Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a wonderful time over the holidays, even though they're not really holidays. So presenting myself, some of you may know me already. My name is Philip Tan. I'm the co-founder and currently standing co-president of EHL Recap. Going over a bit of the general bureaucracy that we have to impose on our sessions. Please note that EHL Recap is a students' organization that basically tries to help everyone else. So we're students like you. We might make a couple mistakes here and there. We proofread what we do, so we try to avoid all of those mistakes. But don't be afraid to point out or to ask for clarifications. We will try to provide the best we can. Small note regarding microeconomics. I'm currently replacing the scheduled tutor on a really short notice because sadly our tutor had a personal situation that makes it impossible for her to be here tonight. So apologies, it's not my material. I might be a little bit rusty, but we'll try our best. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the presentation. That should last roughly half an hour to 45 minutes, I hope. We'll be taking all the questions at the end. I currently have with me as well Mr. Mayer, Alex Mayer, who was our tutor a year back. So hopefully we can manage to go through all of your questions. Also, I'll start with my personal recommendations towards this exam. I know you guys probably have that exam on Monday. Usually when you talk about microecon, the key for you to succeed in your exam will be repetition, because the way MCQs work in microecon is really speed-based. It's about you understanding concepts and knowing how to apply your concepts. And the only way for you to achieve a level of proficiency in that will be just constantly going through your exercises through MCQs that exist. I know that you guys received a packet from your teacher. I do believe it's really well made, so it should help you guys a lot and take advantage because, we didn't have that when we went through. So, any questions before I start presentation? All right, nothing. So let's get on. So, quick summary. You guys are expected to know the functionings of 4 types of competition. So perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. So just to quickly explain everything, perfect competition is it's a really theoretical case. Nothing works like perfect competition in real life. It's a theoretical frame that we use to impose our thinking. But basically, perfect competition, it's a huge market, many firms, many buyers, same good, no barrier to entry, no barrier to exit. That's why we say it's really theoretical, because it means that there is no investment necessary for you to enter the market, and you're not going to be losing any money while exiting your market. Does anyone see the PowerPoint moving?
No. No, but as you put PowerPoint presentation so everyone can navigate.
Oh, my bad.
You can navigate by yourself and just only you will see it because you inserted PowerPoint. You are not sharing your screen directly.
I fixed it.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mash. So second type of competition that we talk about is monopolistic competition. This is probably what's the closest to what actual life is. It's many firms, a similar good. One thing that's really typical nowadays, it wasn't the case 10 years ago, but one thing that's really typical of that nowadays is the cell phone market, because nowadays you see that you have obviously your big players that are your Samsung, your Apple, and so on, but you do have new entrants, Huawei, Xiaomi, and so on, a lot of Chinese brands, OnePlus. The product is fundamentally the same. It's a phone. There's very minor differences between all of them. So there's a competition, but there's those small differences in terms of customer attraction towards the product will make it so that those suppliers can still apply some sort of monopolistic pricing in theory. And then we talk about the 2 last cases, which sometimes exist in real life. They tend to be more created because of barriers that are imposed. First one is oligopoly. Few firms, not a lot of competition. Typical example you would say in Switzerland would be the security market. All the security companies, type Securitas, Protectas, and so on. You see that there's probably in Switzerland about like 3 players on the whole market. So they have a lot of power within the market. And the worst kind, or like the worst kind, the more concentrated kind that exists, which we call monopoly, which is only one firm. Outside of state-imposed companies, you don't really see that. Like, once again, to take the Swiss example, like the CFF, the train company, is state-imposed. Like, the state literally says, like, you cannot have more than one company doing that, so therefore you do have a monopoly in that context. So a couple of important equations as we go through. It will define a lot of the terminology that we'll see later on. It's part of what you might be asked quite a lot during your exam. So just know what those things are. First and foremost, profit, usually written as P, is the function of total revenue minus the total cost. So in other words, what you sold minus what money you used to create the product that you just sold. Total revenue, usually R for revenue, price x quantity, so the price at which you sold your product times the quantity of the profit you sold. Therefore, if we go back to profit's equal to price times quantity minus total cost. And then like the last 3, which are average revenue, self-explanatory, your revenue divided by the amount of products that you bought. I mean, at the end of the day, it's basically equal to the price of the product that you sold. Marginal revenue, which is the derivative of total revenue with respect to the quantity that you sold. It's basically, to explain that quite trivially, is the quantity of revenue that you acquire in addition to each unit of product that you sold more. In real life, that tends to be a parabolical equation, so there's changes depending on the level at which you sell. A lot of what you're asked to do is actually using linear models, so just straight lines within your equations. So it's usually not too bad to calculate. And you have the same concept that exists for costs, and that we call that marginal cost, so the derivative of your total cost with respect to Q. So starting with perfect competition. So perfect competition, as I mentioned before, a lot of sellers, free entry of buyers and seller in the market, no limitations in the theoretical model as well. There is no real regulation in your model. So like there's no state imposing taxes or so on in the pure theoretical model, obviously. In that setting, firms are what we call price takers, meaning that they're forced to accept the price that is indicated to them by their market. They, contrary to what we'll see later on with different types of competitions, they're forced. Like you have an equilibrium. They have no way on earth to be selling their products at a price that is higher. So, and they have no incentive to sell it at a price that's lower, obviously. So they won't do that. In that context, the key equation to determine a lot of what you will be asked to find is that in perfect competition, your marginal revenue will always be equal to the price at which you will sell your good. Therefore, when we talk about your firm's profit, the profit maximization of Q is, so therefore where you make the most profit, is where the marginal cost is equal to the market price. And of course, your profit will be your price minus your average cost times the quantity that you sold. So here you can see graphically what this implies. You'll see on the left diagram, what's represented in yellow will be then your profit. So it's the difference basically between the price at which you sold, which is based on your market equilibrium, and your actual cost of production at a given level of production. And of course, what I mentioned before, why there is no incentive for any company to be selling under their costs will be the situation where you see on the right, where actually the cost of production is higher than the price, and therefore you would be generating an economical loss. So, in perfect competition, you might be asked to determine what is the best course of action for a given company. So, how to say it? Like you might be asked to calculate what type of profit or how much profit the company is actually, or how much loss the company is actually making at a given situation, at a certain price point, and so on. And you might be asked what they should do. So two time frames that we consider, the short run and the long run, those are arbitrary terms. There's no definition behind them. Like you won't be asked like, oh yeah, short term is like 3 months. You will always be told in your exam that like something is short term or long term. So obviously, if your company is making positive profits, whether you're in the short run or in the long run, your course of action is pretty much self-explanatory. You should continue to exploit your market, continue to be like well placed, and try to maintain your positive profits. However, on the short run, it becomes a bit more complicated. With negative profits, it becomes a bit more complicated. So in the long run, obviously, if your total cost is higher than your total revenue, or in trivial terms, you're making losses, the only logical option for your company would be to exit the market. But if we talk about the short run, you will have the option not to just exit the market. You will have the option to do what we call a shutdown. A shutdown is not akin to closing your company. It just means that you will stop your production for a while, basically. So you will, if we apply that to real life, it just means that you will stop paying your variable costs of production. Of course, your company will still be left with your fixed cost, but we don't really care about fixed costs in micro anyways. But you will continuously just stop your production for a certain while and just wait for your market to be better and to reach a point while you can once again reopen your production in a situation that would be allowing you to turn a positive profit. And so, of course, like in that situation, while you're in shutdown, you're making a loss, and your loss is equal to your fixed cost. Any questions so far?
As long as total revenue is greater than or equal to variable cost. Because it just says greater than variable cost. If you can cover your variable costs, then that's a shutdown. No? Am I wrong? No.
So, to continue with the presentation, you have like something that you call your supply curve, which is basically the graphical representation of the quantity that a supplier is willing to sell at a given price. So obviously, for economical reasons, whenever the price is higher, the more you want to sell. It's human nature. It's basically how economy works. And you will see that in context of a perfect competition, your supply curve is always equal to your marginal cost curve. And that is based on the fact that we mentioned before that your price is equal to your marginal cost, which is under the condition of your profit maximization. So that's why you can say that your supply curve is equal to the marginal cost curve. The market behavior of a perfect competition, it's rather basic. So firms making negative profit will exit, and firms making positive profit will remain. That's just natural law of the market. Like as I mentioned before about what should be the decisions that are made in the market. So many new firms may enter the market. Obviously, like if a market seems to be really profitable, that everyone is turning in the market, new people will want to join that market. The corollary of that is that the more people are in the market, by definition, your margin will start to drop because they will like more suppliers, less sales per company, and therefore everything will start dropping down. And then drop in prices, because everything always like has a reaction. The drop in price will also decrease the amount that each company will be willing to supply by extension. So that leaves us in a situation where in the long run, profits are always equal to zero, because when you have a market that is profitable, a lot of people will join the market, and the prices will go down, the profit will go down until reaching zero, and then you'll still have like potentially even more people entering the market because they're late to to the market. Suddenly, people will start making a loss. Some people will leave the market, and it will go back to zero. So on the long run, you will always have a market which the total profit of the market will be equal to zero.
Quick thing to add on, the main reason for that being is because, again, in perfect competition, you have no influence of the price individually. So because you have no influence on the price as a single entity, if the price is too low and you lose money, you have to leave because you can't change the price on your own.
All right. So moving on to monopolies. As I mentioned before, one firm has all the power in the market. No competitions exist in the market because there are no substitutes for the good. As I said, usually it's based on barriers that exists in the market. As I mentioned before, the CFF example, the postal service is another example in Europe generally. In those markets that are marked by monopoly, firms are price makers, so they are the one who decide to set the price. It is, however, important to note that obviously you cannot set the price exactly where you want them, because otherwise, like, let's say that I'm in the monopoly for the phone market. If I want to price my new phone at 1 million, no one's going to buy my phone at 1 million. So there are conditions for the maximization as well. So monopolies, they work in a sort of a weird world where they always need to balance the price and the quantity to maximize set profits. So how do you know what is your revenue? So you know that monopolies sell what consumer wants, and in the condition of monopoly, your marginal revenue is lower than the price. As I said, because the market has the potential to be pricing it higher. Sorry, the company has the potential to be pricing it higher. So marginal revenue curve is always below the market demand curve. And you will see here in your in the diagram that we have here, where in green you then have the demand. In pink, you have your marginal revenue. Quick rule, quick trick about marginal revenue. Sometimes you might be asked to calculate your marginal revenue equation. It's fairly simple. You see that the intersect on the y-axis is the same as the demand. It will always be the case. Just know that then it's just that the function has a slope that is twice as big. So if we look at the example that we have on the side, your demand equation is defined as P equals 40 minus Q, and you see that your MR is 40, so like the same intersect on y-axis minus 2Q, so it's decreasing twice as fast. So yeah, that's basically how you define your profit as a monopoly. Could you please again MR smaller than P? How can I explain MR smaller than P? Oh, okay. Because how can I explain that? Okay, because as a monopoly, you have if I'm a monopolist, I have the power to be matching my price to what is the highest willingness to pay of the consumer based on the rarity of the good that I am producing. So that's why quantity is important. What we typically is like, it's one of those like really dumb example that I like to give, but like consider like the company Supreme, for example. Like Supreme technically sells you garbage. Sorry if there's any Supreme fans in the chat, but Supreme basically, the only reason why they can maintain very high prices is because they maintain scarcity in the market. So whenever they release a new product, it's a really low number. Therefore, the willingness to pay of people is really high. But your marginal revenue decreases way faster than the propensity of people to purchase that specified item, and that's why your marginal revenue will always always have that slope that's bigger. And over time, like the more you produce technically, then the more the gap becomes. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Quick thing to add on marginal. The word marginal, it means if it's a marginal cost or marginal revenue, it means the additional. So if it's a marginal cost, it means the additional cost of producing one more unit. Marginal revenue is the additional revenue you get for producing another unit. So you can understand that when you produce one unit, you get a lot of revenue, but in relation to the previous unit, the more you produce, the less it brings you in the long run. So if you produce one telephone, for example, it brings you a lot of revenue. But if you produce 1,000 phones, well, the 1,000th phone has a lower marginal revenue than the first one, if that makes sense, because obviously it's the equation that shows it that. So the marginal revenue is the revenue that's gained for selling an additional unit. That's what the marginal. Hey man, I like to
calm down, Alex.
I like to.
Okay, so talking about welfare in Monopoly, we can talk about patents. So government will give patents to company. So what is a patent? Basically, it's when you make a new technological discovery, you will patent it, which means that you will be the only one that is capable of producing said item. So this could be one of the reasons why you will manage to create a monopoly. So and also like added benefit, patents tends to incentivize innovation. And yeah, I'll let you read the rest. Is a bit like footnote, like usually it's not too important in the context of the exam. So now we can talk about monopolistic competition. As I mentioned before, monopolistic competition tends to be more realistic than perfect competition. As I mentioned before as well, typical example of that nowadays is market for phones. Why do we say that it's somewhat monopolistic? It's mainly because you see very often a lot of brand loyalty that exists in the context of the phone market. For example, like there are some people that will never buy anything else than an iPhone. There are people that will never buy anything else than a Galaxy. So in that context, people, the companies can somewhat set their price like they would be if they were in a complete monopoly, but they still need to be aware of what they are doing, because of course, obviously, if they go too high, like there's alternatives that exist, so the market is a bit more sensitive to that. So one thing that gets added when we start talking about monopolistic competition, it's something that we call the markup. So the markup, in really trivial terms, is basically the margin that is added by the supplier to the price of the good. So to find it based on the price, you have the formula that says that P is equal to 1 mu being the markup, multiplied by your marginal costs. One point of note as well, when you have very elastic demand, you will have a small markup, because your market is, like, by definition, when you have an elastic demand, means that your market is extremely sensitive to price. So by having a markup that's too large, you'll be shooting yourself in the foot. In contrast to that, obviously, if you have a really inelastic demand, you can afford yourself to have a higher markup. And so that's it. So, and basically, like, that elasticity of demand, if you're asked to compare between two markets, the elasticity of demand basically defines how competitive your market is, basically. So you can also define that through your markup then, obviously. So it means that, like, in a market where markups tends to be small, it just means that your market is extremely competitive and that there's a lot of valuable alternatives. So monopolistic competition in the medium and the long run. So since we work in a system where there's still competitions, as long as your market is profitable in the long terms, new firms will always be joining the market. Because new firms start joining the market, customers will also start to purchase substitutes. As I mentioned to you before, means that your market will become progressively more and more elastic. Demand and profit will decrease. Until when can you say it's a small markup? Okay, yeah, once again, that is something that isn't a theoretical concept, Jonathan. There is not really in your class
normally, like in real life, it's defined by different organizations.
Yeah.
Like if you are registered on the stock exchange defines the size of your market.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So if you guys didn't hear what my comrade just said, it's in real. Okay. Yeah, shut up. In real life, of course, obviously this depends on the market. That depends on the product that you're selling. Usually there are guidelines that exist that are set by the industry, that are set by the organizations within the industry. There's also a lot of things that enter into consideration when you talk about real life, because, for example, there are markets where markups, like theoretical markups, are regulated by the states. You cannot go above a certain percentage of your total price. So you would have to look at the industry. In the context of your exam, since everything that you're asked is theoretical, actually, and they're based on theoretical frameworks, you will always be indicated whether or not you have a high or a low markup. Does that work for you, Jonathan?
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Yes.
So to come back to where I was. So, of course, because you have new substitutes that enter the market, demand and profit will decrease. Same case than what we talked about regarding the perfect competition before. But firms will continue to behave as monopolies, even though they aren't really monopolies anymore. Profit, and eventually over the long run, extremely long run, profit will eventually decrease to zero. Side note on that thing, if you talk about real life, typically the way for you to go past that and to try to always maintain really high profit is constant innovation. And that is the reason why you buy a phone every 8 months on average in our group age. Is not because people are clumsy and they drop their phone. It's just because to try to maintain those high profits and to maintain their ability to act as monopolies, companies such as Apple or Samsung will continuously create new products that are more innovative, even though that can be discussed, in order to still create like new niche markets where they can maintain their monopolies. And yes, so and therefore welfare loss will also always remain, because obviously price higher than marginal revenue, therefore welfare loss for the consumer. So, lastly, oligopolies. Oligopolies are markets where few firms sell most of the goods in the market. For example, the fast food market. Fast food market is competitive. There's a ton of alternative, but you do have some extremely big players. Like, for example, if you look at what fast foods you will find in Lausanne, what is it? Like, at the end of the day, like, you're talking about like huge companies that are like McDonald's plus Burger King plus KFC. And then those companies will probably control 80, 90, 95% of the market, depending on what market you're talking about. And then the remaining percentage is fought over by smaller companies. So like mom and dad owned a kebab shop, for example. In these contexts, the big players, the way for them to maximize their profit is to seek to steal customers from other companies. Obviously, in those contexts, firms do not cooperate between each other, and also they do not trust each other. So they will always try to outbeat each other. They will always, they will always try to be better than one another, if that means that they can get one more consumer from another company. That leads us in a situation where we apply a concept called game theory. Game theory is basically the science of opposition, strategical opposition in a sense. The slide didn't change for you. Okay. Wait. Does it change now? Or does anyone else have problem with the slides not turning?
It's still oligopolies.
Oligopoly?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, when the typical framework, how we analyze game theory, and that will be the only scale at which you will be asked to analyze it at the level that you're at in micro, is by basically contrasting two companies that are acting against each other with two different strategies. So if you see what we have here on the bottom right, Starbucks against SF Coffee, with the decision of whether or not advertise or to not advertise. So and you see, of course, obviously in your table that you do have your different outcomes. So one thing that's important to note is in that context, the companies, they want more not to lose than they actually want to win. So they will always take the decisions that will maximize what they can get with the maximum certainty. And you have, you can create something that we call a Nash equilibrium, which is a set of strategy where no changes are possible. So for example, in the example that you see here, your Nash equilibrium is for both companies to advertise. Because if they do not advertise, they run the risk that the other company advertises, and then they will be at the worst place, theoretically. So, as I said, of course, they could both decide to not advertise and earn more than by both advertising. But because they do not trust each other, they do not trust that the other company will not advertise while they don't advertise. So therefore, the ideal logic for them is to both advertise. One point of note of that is then when you have one Nash equilibrium, like in the case that we explained, you will have definite outcomes. So you will be you know for sure that this is what companies will do. You can have situations that are a bit more messy than that, where you have no Nash equilibrium or more than one Nash equilibrium, actually. And in those situations, you can't really say anything about what will be happening in your market because you simply cannot define.
Right, quick thing about a Nash equilibrium, it's defined by an area in which no company has the want to deviate. So if they were to deviate away from a certain decision, they will be at a loss. So I'm just about to get to that. So Nash equilibria is essentially any point in the game theory for which a company, if they were to change their decision, they would be at a loss. It is also possible to have two Nash equilibria or more than one Nash equilibria. So in this Starbucks and SF Coffee example, well, if Starbucks, for instance, decides to not advertise, instead of making 12, they will make 10. So they will be at a loss. So if they change their decision, assuming SF Coffee does not, they will make $2 less. So for Starbucks, not a smart idea to change because they end up making less money. If you look at SF Coffee, currently they're advertising and they make $12. If Starbucks doesn't change their decision and SF changes and decides they don't want to advertise, they end up making $10 as well. So they actually end up making less money. Therefore, this would be a Nash equilibria because neither Starbucks or SF Coffee will want to move. If they move, they end up making $2 less than if they both decide to advertise. Mm-hmm. Therefore, 12-12 would be a Nash equilibria. I hope that makes a bit more sense.
And to finish up with that, basically also because I will anticipate your next question, the reason why your Nash equilibrium is not at 15-15 is because if you're at a not advertising position, you expose yourself to the risk of losing if the other company decides to move. So therefore, nothing is at equilibrium, as Alex just mentioned before.
Yeah, adding on. So if you look at the 15-15, right? Adding on to what Philip said, if you look at the 15-15, if Starbucks decides to say, if Starbucks says, right, okay, I want to advertise, you'll see that they, instead of making 15, they end up making $20. So that's good news for Starbucks because they end up making more money, right? The whole point of a company is to make money. So Starbucks would obviously, assuming SF Coffee doesn't advertise, Starbucks will advertise. So Starbucks will want to make $20. Because Starbucks will want to make $20, SF Coffee will say, right, I want to advertise as well, because if I advertise, I end up making $20 as well, just like Starbucks does. So SF Coffee will decide to advertise because it's more advantageous for them. In the end, if they both decide to advertise, they both make $12. So they don't actually make the 20 that they originally wanted to, but they make significantly more than already the 10. And by moving on to advertising, you actually prevent your competitor from getting the most money possible, if that makes sense. So by SF Coffee changing to advertise, they are not letting Starbucks make $20, but rather they're only letting Starbucks make $12. So this would be, again, a place they don't want to deviate, because if they deviate, they make less money.
So, does that answer the question?
I'm not a dictionary fan.
All right, okay. Okay, perfect. So, moving on. So, lastly, last chapter for you, from what I was told, would be talking about labor market. Quick note from myself, labor market should be the trickiest thing for you this semester, because it always tends to be really counterintuitive. So in your last couple of days that you have before the exam, I would heavily advise that you try to familiarize yourself as much as you can with labor market. But if you can't, do not worry too much, because you still have the rest of the exam that you can nail. So, couple definitions to start. In the labor market, households provide labor. So households, so people like you and I, we are the labor supply, because this is what we are selling in theory. Like, if we try to make it a kind to a market, is what we're selling. We're selling our time, we're selling our competencies, we're selling our skills. So we provide the labor. Firms look labor because labor is part of the inputs that are necessary to producing goods and services. So they are the demand for labor. Households and firms agree for a certain labor price. So basically, what is the compensation that a company is going to pay me for the service I provide them for my work? This can be called a salary. Usually in theoretical cases and like in your diagrams, it's called W for wage. So labor market is considered to be a perfect competition. In real life, it is mostly true. Just note that in real life, you will have boundaries that are set by the states. So, for example, you do have the existence of minimum wage, minimum hourly wage. You have what we call in Switzerland, doesn't exist in all countries, but in Switzerland, we have what we call convention collective, which is the association of each job that talks to the employers, and then they decide that there's a flat rate that exists. And of course, obviously, companies don't tend to like to pay people too much, because they like to maximize their profits. So the firm goals still remains to maximize profits. So they will hire the people to try to create that profit, to creating product. But obviously, the condition of that is that they cannot afford to overpay for the production that they want to achieve. So looking at the labor market and the labor demand, a firm maximizes profit when price times the marginal product of labor, so the price of the good you sell, times the marginal product of labor, it's equal to the wage that they pay. So point to note is that if wages decrease, the labor demand increases. And labor demand shifts with the increase in marginal products of labor. Typically, this is associated to new technology, because marginal production of labor, which is the downward sloping curve that you see in the example, it's always decreasing. This is a theoretical case. It's linear. In real life, it's not linear. It's a curve, so it will start up and then it will go down. the reason why it's always decreasing is that you have problems that exist with the efficiency of increased labor, basically. So if, let's say that now I have a field, like that I produce potatoes. If I hire one person, this person is going to produce a certain amount of potatoes, like let's say 10. If I hire now a second person, they can both specialize a little bit. They can both separate the work. They can better optimize their time. So the MPL will go up. Suddenly, like instead of producing 10 potatoes per person, they might actually be producing 12 potatoes per person just because they're more efficient. And that logic can be continued. So that's why, like when you do it in real life, you have this kind of curve because at the beginning, the more people you add, the more specialized people become, the more time can be managed, and therefore the more production you can have. But in any circumstances, you will always reach a point where your efficiency starts to decrease. So now let's just try to put my example to the absolute limit. Let's say that I now hire 10,000 people to work on my potato field. If you put 10,000 people in your potato field, you're not doing any work. You're hosting a festival. So people will start losing efficiency because they cannot move correctly. They cannot use their machinery. They will constantly be bothering each other. So at the end of the day, this is why we consider that the MPL is going down. So in a lot of theoretical cases, if you're asked in a linear model, you always tend to see an MPL that is negative, because it's just what it represents. It's the long run. Just as a side note, once again, in case you are asked to maximize the amount of people that are necessary to perform a job, to find the quantity of labor that's necessary, it's just simply the derivative of your MPL function that will give you, the derivative of your MPL function that you set to 0. And once you solve that, you will be able to find the quantity of labor that's necessary for you to maximize your production. So, moving on to the labor supply. So the households decide how much labor they want to supply. So yeah, just simply, it's just in reality, it's more akin to the number of people that are available in the working market. So usually we define that as like any person that's between certain ages, so between the normal age where you start. Yes, so the slides will be on our website. Don't worry about that. In reality, like when we talk about that for real life cases, we tend to define what the labor supply is as the number of people who are in working age and in ability to work. So basically, any individual between the age of 18 and 65 that is not, that doesn't have an ailment that stops them from working. But we do define that households decide how much labor to supply, because there's actually nothing stopping me right now to say that I don't want to work. So therefore, households determine how much labor they actually want to supply. Also, there's nothing stopping me from telling my employer that I only want to work 50%, for example. Another side note of that is that it cannot be determined if high or low hourly wages provide more or less supply. That actually tends to be more related to the general environment of in which your market is evolving. So, like, for example, like right now, like we might be at the beginning of a new economical crisis. A lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot more people need money, so a lot more people are willing to work. So our labor supply is increasing. Maybe in a couple of years, if like the situation goes back to normal, a lot more people will be in a position to afford not to work, and your labor supply will naturally drop down. So and labor supply basically works as the same as the market demand. The only difference is that the axes are wage and labor, contrary to if I go back to before, it's, sorry, no, that's not the one. Sorry, I don't have what I wanted for that. But yeah, so it's just based on an axis that is wage and labor, or in other terms, how much work people are ready to supply for a given price. So if we talk about the equilibrium, if you want to define what's the wage in the market, we will go back to, like, this basically takes you back to to a lot of the concepts that you've seen in the first part of your semester. It's not really different from all the basic equilibriums that you saw at the beginning of the semester. You will just need to get both your equations and manage to set them together, and you will find them at the point of equilibrium. You can sometimes see a shift in labor supply. So, for example, like in the case here where we go from S1 to S2, it can have many reasons because, like, for example, introduction of tax, could be an introduction of tax. It could end up being changes in technology, replacement of people, like a massive pandemic that kills half of the population. Can be a lot of things that will shift your supply of labor. Just one thing to note, that those shifts in the end will tend to will readapt the wage level, will readapt the quantity level, which, depending on what market you're talking about, can have a finite impact on your demand. All right, so this is the end of the presentation that our team had for you. I hope this helped you a lot. We'll now be taking your questions with Alex and try to do our best to answer. So please feel free to either type your question in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourselves. So Elena, to maximize labor is derivative of MPL equal to 0. Okay, to maximize labor, yes, to maximize labor production of, to maximize the labor production, so basically the maximum efficiency depending on the number of people that need to work to produce something for a company, yes, it's a derivative of MPL set to 0 and then solve the equation for L. Yes, because as I mentioned, this is a simplified because this is a simplified case. You will never be asked to find what is the maximization in a case where it's not parabolical, because because that example that you have here on the side is a really simplified model that only focuses on the downward sloping part. Your actual point where the quantity is optimal, where the labor is optimal is higher up to the left. So that's why I mentioned before that it would theoretically always be a parabol. So to solve something like that, you necessarily need to have an equation that's parabolical. So you will have something like 12 plus 12q minus 12 plus 12L minus 5L squared, for example. And there you would be able to solve that. If you either want to type it, read it, or even better, if you can screenshot it and put it in the chat. In this case, your full black bar is what we call the budget constraint. So budget constraint is basically how much of good 1 and good 2 combined together as a package can Zach buy based on his income or the amount of money that he has. One example that we always that I love about that is what we call the kebab versus beer example. So consider Q1 is beers, Q2 is kebabs. So of course you have money in your bank account, so with set amount of money. For example, you could buy 20 beers, or you could buy 6 kebabs, or you can buy potentially, I don't know, just out of my mind like that, maybe you can afford to buy 3 beers and 2 kebabs and so on. So this is what we call the budget constraints, what you can realistically do with your money. The dotted line, so the dotted curve, is what we call the satisfaction curve. So this basically represents the relationship of the two products based on what pleasure they will bring to Zach, schematically speaking. So it means that, for example, if you read the line going back to my kebabs and beers, that would mean that, for example, 2 beers and 1 kebab means that it's the same, it would mean that it's the same satisfaction for Zach as 3 kebabs and 1 beer, for example. So that's what this line represents. So the condition for maximization of satisfaction is that your budget constraint becomes a tangent to that curve. So in the first case, you see that it's touching the line as a tangent. So this is where the point it's maximized. So his satisfaction is maximized. So, but in the second one, what you see is that there is a small part of your dotted line that is below the budget constraint line. Means that he's not maximizing his pleasure. It means that Zach has to settle for something that doesn't exactly maximize his pleasure compared to his budget. He's forced to settle down for something. And sometimes you can see the other example where that line would, the dotted curve will be completely shifted to the right. And there the two lines won't be touching anymore. And if those two lines are not touching anymore, what it means is that like the person is completely under budget to be actually able to satisfy anything. Does that answer your question, Claudia?
Yes, but isn't it the opposite? So the before it's like the maximized line,
Well,
and
no.
then after.
What do you mean?
So basically, I thought that before he's more happy than after.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, here in the answers it say that satisfaction has increased.
Right. I need
Yeah,
to
that's
zoom
why
in.
I don't understand, because the correct answer is that Zach's satisfaction has increased.
I understand. Okay. So, okay, what I said before stands technically, just that you need to like zoom on the thing. I think this is what your teacher is trying to imply, is that you're not, I don't think you're really at a tangent in Q1. I think your dot is slightly inside your curve. Like for me, that would be like the explanation to that. Okay, but I think this is like kind of mean of him to be fair. Yeah, that's the only thing that can explain that. But it's really mean of your professor. I would expect like in an exam for the picture to be clearer than that.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
I don't know if it helps, but I just have a note that the labor is 45 and the wage is 420. And
Per person,
yeah,